Okay, now we're going to consider the Garden of Love, which is in the Experience collection. So here's the poem. Um, Blake, of course, was a Christian, a very committed Christian, but was very critical of the established church. He had a thing about authority, really. So the idea of priests and vicars and people telling you what to think was inimical inimical to him. Okay, he was very in sympathy with the views of Paracelsus, who was a Renaissance thinker, who propounded the view that God could be experienced through our own individual imaginations. And I think that Blake, as a romantic, was very sympathetic to that idea that everybody could find their own way to God. So many of Blake's poems are very Christian in nature and religious in nature, but very critical of the institutions of the church as they had grown up over the centuries. Okay, so the Garden of Love, the very title itself, perhaps, is a biblical allusion. It takes us back, of course, to the Garden of Eden, that place at the very beginning of time in not just the Christian belief system, but the Judaic belief system and indeed the Islamic belief system. So the Bible, of course, the Old Testament of the Bible is shared by these three monotheistic religions. And Eden is a place of purity, it's paradise, it's where there's no shame about sexual experience, no clothes, where people live in harmony. And of course the act of original sin, as the story goes, of course, Eve being tempted by Satan to eat of the apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, leads to the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. And it's unless you're of a fundamentalist turn of mind, most people would say that it is a myth to explain the existence of pain, of shame, of death, and the darker things in life. So the poem begins, as we often see in Blake, it's a personal vision. I went, okay. The persona is speaking to us. I went to the garden of love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. Again, we come back to the use of the word green to suggest nature. And again, nature being associated with childhood. I used to play, we imagine, as a child. Then this is where this happened. And again, we've got this contrast. If you look at the word built, really suggests sort of construction, suggests a man-made, a human-made artifact. A chapel was built. It's almost as if we have this contrast between the rural world of the green and the urban world of buildings. A chapel was built. The chapel, of course, being a sort of symbol of the established church, perhaps, here. Now let's look in the second stanza about the way that the chapel is described. The gates of the chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. Well, again, images of enclosure, images of being the child here, or the child grown into a man, being alienated, being shut out from the religious experience. Thou shalt not, of course, being an allusion to the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament. And perhaps Blake here drawing attention to a strand of negativity in conventional religious thinking. Thou shalt not. Many of the commandments are about not what you can do, but what you can't do. So I turn to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. Again, the flowers representing this original state of childhood, the closeness to nature, perhaps the Garden of Eden, which here has been crushed by human activity, by human intervention. I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. Tombstones and graves being man-made constructs. Tombstones, of course, perhaps reflecting what Blake sees as the death-obsessed nature of the established church. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. A fantastic image there, which encapsulates this notion of the repressive nature of the church. Note how the priests are like authority figures that Blake doesn't like. The gowns they wear are black, linking them perhaps with death, with darkness. Look at the internal rhymes: gowns, rounds, briars, desires, and the repetitive nature of some of the sounds, the alliteration of binding with briars, the assonance I, ow, ow. It's a very circular, the sound patterns mimic the circularity of the priest's movements, and perhaps also enact this sense of entrapment, of tying down, of holding down, binding with briars my joys and desires. Briars are like sort of thorns, which again perhaps remind us of the crown of thorns that was placed on Christ's head in the Bible before the crucifixion. Briars, of course, being a natural image, but unusually perhaps in Blake, here being used in a negative sense. The thorny briars, sort of symbolising the way in which the church restricts people's emotions or tries to control people's sexual desires, perhaps. And that's an argument that is still with us. I mean, you only have to look in the paper most days to see stories about various religions sort of controlling sexual activity or sexual desire in many ways. So quite a relevant poem, I think, to us in many ways today. So there we have it, the Garden of Love. The general form of it is quite hymn-like in a way. The quatrain, the 4 lines, the regular rhyme, scene, green, door, bore. And the rhythms very like a sort of hymn that many people in his original audience would have been very familiar with.